The Depression had long gone. It took a terrible, painful war to do it, but that pulled the country together. And as Allied troops advanced across Europe and moved from island to island in the Pacific, optimism blossomed. Things were going to be better. We all hummed, "I'll be home for Christmas." We had just about won the war. Now we were ready to win the peace. Young men and women who had seen London and Paris, Honolulu and Yokohama, weren't ready to settle down on the farm. Energy and a spirit of let's get things done ran through the veins of these Americans, who then went out and invented electric typewriters and automatic washers, frozen fish and reclining chairs. You remember those big fins on that new 1948 Cadillac? The idea came right from the P-38 fighter plane. God's timing, of course, is perfect. Someplace about the time the war began, we invented teenagers. We began to recognize adolescence as a special period in life. Youth came into their own with their jitterbug and bobby socks, saddle shoes and pegged pants. God's people had noticed too and had begun to hold special meetings for youth. Although families, parents, and kids of all ages came, they'd rent a big hall for Saturday night, not a church, a neutral place they called it. And they'd bring in some upbeat music, some testimonies, keep it fast-paced. In the middle of all the enthusiasm, a well-known preacher would lay the gospel on the kids, and thousands turned to Jesus. Down in Texas, Jim Rayburn began something he called Young Life. Percy Crawford on the East Coast pioneered in youth evangelism. Ed Darlin and others began Voice of Christian Youth rallies in Detroit as early as the late 30s. In New York City, Jack Wurtson packed 20,000 into Madison Square Garden, and 10,000 more were turned away. In Indianapolis, Roger Malsbury, a pastor, began Saturday night rallies. Al and Vidi Metzger in Kansas City called their meetings Singspirations. So did George Wilson in Minneapolis. In Washington, D.C., Chuck Harwood, a veteran of Guadalcanal, began a rally he called Christian Youth Fellowship. And in Philadelphia, Walter Smith had to lock the doors of the hall after the meetings began to keep out the crowds trying to get in. Overseas as well, in Germany, India, China, and other places, men and women clearly prompted by the Spirit were working in new and untested ways to win youth for Christ.
In America, it seemed the time was ripe for youth evangelism, and people had nowhere to go really on Saturday night. You could take a date to Youth for Christ. You could go in a car, fill up a car and go to Youth for Christ. The churches weren't doing a great deal in youth work, and it was just the time was ripe for this.
While in Nyack, some of the young folks from the college on Saturday night would go into New York City, and there we would go to the Word of Life Hour in downtown New York, where Jack Wurtson carried on Saturday night rallies.
I remember thinking it was as if somebody had poured gasoline on a farm and lit a match, because every place I turned, there was Youth for Christ.
The critics, of course, will always be with us. One called the movement a hootin' and a hollerin' for Jesus. Another talked about wild gyrations and a fundamentalist circus horse that pawed the ground 3 times to answer the question, how many persons are there in the Trinity? On the other hand, General MacArthur, no less, officially invited Youth for Christ to Japan, and newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst ordered his editors to give it headlines. Ask those who were there, how did Youth for Christ begin? And you'll hear a lot of explanations and a lot of names. This was a movement begun by many, but one name keeps showing up. Torrey Johnson was a pastor on the west side of Chicago and a seminary professor. He was an unconventional, no-nonsense, energetic, bold, get-it-done kind of guy. Time magazine called him cheerleaderish, a spark plug. More to the point, however, he had the unusual habit of listening to and trusting God. Torrey had been the first speaker at the Indianapolis rally, but when students and colleagues began to urge him to do something in Chicago, he hesitated.
When we came to Chicago, I came as a student to Moody. And as a student, I worked on the radio station. Bev Shea came from New York, where he had been with Jack Wurtson. And Bev and I would talk about the need in Chicago and what could be done for the young people in Chicago. And Bev and I often, as we would laugh and talk about what could be done, Bev finally said, "I think Torrey Johnson is our man."
He was on the road in the spring of 1944 when in the small hours of the morning he called Doug Fisher, who worked for WMBI radio station in Chicago. "We're going to do it, Doug," he shouted. "Now's the time, and we need you." Well, the next day, Fisher gave the station 2 weeks' notice. As he tells the story,
I shall never forget going into the office of Mr. Lovelace, who at that time was the program director. I said, "Mr. Lovelace, I feel that the Lord wants me to leave the staff of WMBI. And of course he was surprised and said, "Why? What are you going to do?" Well, I said, "I'm going to become involved in something that's called Youth for Christ." Well, he looked at me and he said, "Well, you're gainfully employed here. What are you going to be eating 2 weeks from now?" Well, I said, "I guess, I hope food."
Doug Fisher never did miss a meal, and Chicagoland Youth for Christ began with a rally at Chicago's Orchestra Hall. It had world-famous acoustics, but it lacked air conditioning, so it was available to Youth for Christ on Saturday nights until fall. Torrey put up the $5,000 to hold it, and on May 27, 1944, with Billy Graham, a little-known pastor from a Chicago suburb, as the speaker, Chicagoland Youth for Christ began. The response was overwhelming. They filled the hall each week and turned thousands away. Bob Cook, Torrey's assistant pastor at Midwest Bible Church, and his brother-in-law led the singing. For soloists, Torrey recruited Rose Arzamenian, a young Chicagoan with a powerful and clear voice, and George Beverly Shea, who went on to be the soloist for Billy Graham. Every well-known preacher they could snag took the platform. Harry Ironside, Jim Rayburn, Walter Wilson, Wendell Lovelace, V.R. Edmond, R.G. Letourneau. They all preached at Chicagoland Youth for Christ in that summer of 1944. When October came, they considered closing down for the winter, but the momentum was so great they moved to Moody Church for the winter months, then rented Chicago Stadium for a climax rally and filled it with 30,000. Wendy Collins was a teenager in Chicago at the time.
Nothing was bigger than life than Youth for Christ in those days. And it was bigger than life. You'd go to that rally, you'd see all these people marching, and you'd see all the great music and the huge choir. And it was all so exciting. It was the kind of excitement you couldn't get past it.
In the middle of it all, the motor, the encourager, the flag bearer was Torrey.
I remember Torrey. Tall, lean, raspy voice, and always at the office working. He was working on all these rallies, on all the background things that had to be done for rallies. You see, Torrey was a leader. He never waited for things to get done. He did it, and he made them happen. But he also was a man of God. He also preached. He also spent time with the Lord. He could never have done any of these things without his relationship to Jesus Christ.
The end of 4 years of German occupation. With allied ingenuity, the big port may yet play a part in the conquest of the Reich itself.
1945 was a year to remember. Germany surrendered in May, and Americans danced in the streets. German and Russian soldiers embraced on the River Elbe. Japan gave up several months later, and a few weeks after that, the first troops poured off the ships in New York City. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, a group had begun to pray for the young people of that city.
We met together, Dawson Trotman, Bob Munger, Dick Hillis, Don Hillis. We gathered together for prayer. Every Tuesday morning, we prayed about 2 hours and prayed for God's Holy Spirit to move in great power in Los Angeles.
Soon, several hundred people began to meet and pray in one of the large churches. And on January 6, 1945, Hugh B. Mitchell led the first Los Angeles Youth for Christ Jubilee. By now, the fire had spread to Grand Rapids and Charlotte, Shanghai and Paris, Norfolk and Minneapolis, Cape Town and Rio, and servicemen, wherever they found themselves overseas, began rallies.
I was in the military, and when we got a burden on our weekends, we had off-duty weekends. I was going to B-29 school, and I just had a burden to reach kids. And then when we landed in Tokyo, it just seemed the natural thing to have Tokyo Youth for Christ.
Back in Chicago, men and women in uniform were flooding the streets, and the Windy City was ready for the big one.
So the Holy Spirit spoke to us, take Soldier Field. Soldier Field, it was larger then than it is now. It seated up to 100,000 people. But we felt God wanted us to go.
And go they did. It was the mother of all youth rallies. 500 uniformed nurses marched past a large lighthouse and formed a living white cross before the platform. Torrey told Merrill Dunlop, a well-known Chicago musician, to put together a musical extravaganza. So Merrill came up with a 5,000-voice, white-shirted choir, a 300-piece band, and 8 grand pianos. World champion indoor miler Gil Dodds ran 2 laps around the field and gave his testimony. Representatives from China, India, Africa, Russia, in native dress, joined in a missionary pageant. And war hero Bob Evans, resplendent in uniform, told the 70,000 people what Jesus Christ meant to him. Rain had fallen the evening before, and Torrey and his team prayed, "Lord, put this meeting on a miracle basis." And when Percy Crawford stood to preach, the stars were shining, and when he gave the invitation that night, hundreds signed decision cards. The movement attracted major news coverage. Time magazine ran a piece trumpeting its box office appeal and amateur night entertainment. It quoted Torrey with no less a goal than the spiritual revitalization of America and the complete evangelization of the world in our generation. It was inevitable that the leaders of these rallies around the country would get together. Torrey was tapped to be a chairman of a temporary Youth for Christ International, and promptly set up a temporary office in Chicago. Finally, on July 19, 1945, they made it official. Everybody in the world of evangelism was there. In Kansas, Vidi Metzger, wife of Al Metzger, remembers.
But Torrey Johnson called us and he said, "Al, you've got to be there. Mortgage your house, mortgage your wife, do anything but be there."
The there was Winona Lake. 42 delegates hammered out a constitution and made Torrey the first president. The calls came quickly after that. Rally directors, laymen, pastors all across America wanted to reach the young people in their city. How do we get it going? Can you send a speaker? We need help. Torrey hired that young pastor from the suburbs, Billy Graham, pointed to an empty room and said, "This is your office."
And I remember going into that empty office on Wells Street, and they said, "This is your office," and I didn't see a chair or a desk anywhere. So the first couple that wanted me to come to their town and help organize a Youth for Christ meeting was from Jackson, Mississippi, and we all 3 sat on the floor.
Graham was so popular, he flew 135,000 miles that first year and was cited by United Airlines as their top civilian passenger. Torrey soon had 6 field men living out of duffel bags and staying lean from crisscrossing the country. Bob Finley, a national collegiate boxing champion from the University of Virginia, was the second man Torrey hired. Then Cliff Barrows and T.W. Wilson. Jess Moody wasn't on the payroll, but the international office kept him booked and living out of a suitcase. By the end of 1946, hundreds of communities were holding Youth for Christ rallies, but they needed help. So besides preaching, the field men came alongside these concerned laymen and pastors and helped them set up boards, rent auditoriums, prepare publicity, and once in a while they had to pick up the pieces when it all fell apart. Bob Cook called the men of Youth for Christ racehorses. They were always running off someplace in the Lord's business, and you had to put a rein on them to keep them on track. Today we think of these men and women as pioneers. Many of them truly had a sense of history, of breaking ground. Some of the early leaders were pastors, but others came out of business. Jack Cochran in Detroit was an engineer. Al Metzger in Kansas City worked for an airline. Gene French in the same city was a carpenter. Ray Clendenin up in the thumb of Michigan was a dairy farmer. In common, they had a passion to win teenagers to Jesus Christ, and God drew them out of unlikely places. What in the world motivated men like this to follow the sudden wind of a youth movement? After all, as Bob Cook used to say, we offer you nothing except blood, sweat, and tears. The perks were few. The salary, if any, was small and uncertain. Stories abound of God's provision at exactly the right time, when the rent was due, or the cupboard bare, or there was no money for a ticket back home.
I guess what I appreciate about those early days is the electrifying desire to serve Jesus Christ.